In 1975, that piece of music signified the coming of a shark in a very famous film called Jaws. The interesting part about that piece of music is that, not the long, awkward pause that I actually started my talk with, which ended up being a bit awkward, but the fact that that long pause, the two-note sequence in that piece of music, signified a shark in its absence. This slide here presents the first appearance of the shark in '75 in that film, but you never saw the shark. The music itself, in the presence of a pause of the shark, actually signified its presence very dramatically. And the very music that John Williams, who composed the score, put together is this two-note sequence that had long pauses between it. So you heard, the music very slow, the shark might be far away, the music very fast, the shark is close by. The music itself represented the shark before the shark appeared, because the shark, in fact, was three sharks. Bruce, the shark, had a lot of mechanical difficulties, so we never actually saw the shark until halfway through the film. Viewers didn't possibly know that. You guys may know that by now. But in fact, when we finally saw the shark, it was in silence. Roy Scheider saw the shark finally in this scene, and the music had represented the shark so dramatically that when the shark finally appeared in silence, it was that much of a greater surprise. The pause has great power. Silence has great power, whether it be to communicate in awkwardness, as we saw, to communicate information. Information is contained in silence or in these pauses. And I think we have a great deal to learn from that. So today we're going to talk about the power of the pause, very appropriately after a bit of a pause over lunch, and what we can learn about that as designers. So we're going to talk about it across a number of places. User experience, absolutely, but across discourse, physical spaces, personal spaces, sound, thinking about urban noise as well as music, and bringing it all back to sort of relate to what we do every day. And I promise that might be the last and longest awkward pause. So first I want to talk about communication and our very discourse. So, hello. My name is Liz Danzico, and I live in New York City. Hello is actually my first word that I ever said, not mama or data or user experience or design. Might be different from you guys, but mine was hello. And I've always been interested in words. I used to collect words out of the dictionary. I was one of those people that tried to read the dictionary from cover to cover, which didn't work, by the way. But I've been very interested in words specifically. I started then collecting words by removing parts of them because I felt they were more usable. So I started collecting them, and my own site, Bobulate, came from this list of words. But as much as I loved words, I was terrified to use words. And I mean that in that if you love words, you probably write. And if you write, at some point someone's going to ask you to stand up in front of people. When I stood up in front of people, nothing would come out. It was terrifying. Silence would come out, right? And then I got to sort of get up in front of people and tell my stories, and I would be really nervous. What's terrible about this is that human behavior, according to someone named Michael Erard, who wrote a book called is that there's something called a momentary control problem, which is if you're a pianist and you practice music and you get up to play that music, you then plunk down the wrong note. Or if you're an actor and you practice your lines and you get up to say those lines, you say the wrong thing. Or if you're a person who loves words and you get up to talk about things, you might actually miss an important point you want to say or not say anything at all. According to Michael Erard, what's really problematic for us as a culture is that we love smoothness. I love this MacBook Air. I'll say that on stage right now, that we love our iPhones and we love our lattes. We love smooth things, including one word after the other. When we design things, when we talk about things, we like one thing to follow the other. And as a human, in American culture specifically, but probably not so different in any other culture, on a given day, you speak 7,500 to 22,500 words a day. And it's up to us to make sense of those words on the fly without saying or ah or pausing, because we love this fluency. We love the fluency in design, we love it in speech, and it's up to us to sort of arrange those pieces in an order that makes sense. So I'm designing the user experience for you every time we talk. And we are reluctant to pause so much in our speech, even, as one example, that we go to these public speaking classes. I've never been to one, but I've heard about them. There's one called Toastmasters that would actually fine someone in the US a nickel or a quarter, I can't remember, every time you say the word or ah. So my question is, why are we editing out these pauses? I think we're too impatient. I think we can't wait for things, and I think that the pause itself has a lot of valuable information, including the fact that we need pauses to understand. If I'm talking at you and talking at you and talking at you and I never stop, you actually can't retain that information. So pauses themselves contain important information. The oldest example of American umming comes from a man named Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, that would be great. No, it actually comes from a man named Thomas Edison, who, Thomas Jefferson's interesting. We can talk about him too, in fact. From now on, you'll hear every time I say the word and I hope someone's keeping count like Nicholas Felton can draw something for us to sort of track that later on. Thomas Edison, in 1888, in the first recording of his voice, he presented the perfected phonograph. And let's listen to that.
Now, Mr. Blaine, as you've been nearly around the world, our system unit will go to Milan. Milan will go to Rome. And then to Bombay.
So about the only word that you hear in that whole recording is right? So or has historical power, right? It has historical relevancy in that the very first recorded words started with an so graceful. And this kind of pausing actually allows us to understand information more. It highlights the points we want to make. Kind of reminds me of someone else that we know pretty well, Jan Tschichold, who talks about whitespace. Whitespace is an activating element. It's not a passive background, right? So if whitespace enhances the content around it, how can we think about that in our discourse, in the spaces that we're designing, in the experiences that we're designing as well? That goes for our speech, too. My favorite example of this is someone named Austin Kleon, who looks at whitespace, in fact, quite differently, and creates new meaning out of the white spaces he sees, not just around the text, but around words themselves, and creates something called blackout poetry from those spaces. So something that had a particular meaning is then changed by his version of seeing white space around it, causing all kinds of black silence, if you will, or pauses. Jonathan Safran Foer just wrote a book called Tree of Codes, which uses white space in quite a different way, or these pauses, in that the die cuts in the paper lay over one another in order to create new meaning over and over again. So my point in talking about all these pauses in sort of discourse and communication is that the pause itself, like the white space in our speech, can actually enhance the very content, the relevancy and the meaning, if we just take a pause when we're talking, communicating to others. But discourse is not the only place that we can think about pauses as being interesting. Physical spaces, too, actually have a lot of value for us. If we think about something that Walter Benjamin said, which is, architecture is something that we experience habitually in a state of distraction. So if we're experiencing it in a state of distraction, which is kind of, I think, everybody's looking at me right now. That's really interesting. So typically, a lot of people, whenever we're in a talk, are kind of looking elsewhere. We're distracted by so many things. But yet when you take something away, whether it be silence, so it's the sound, or a building like this in your daily walk, suddenly the new place takes on meaning, right? Something has disappeared and your flow and your form changes, and everything about that space is revealed in a new way, whether it's beautiful or sort of shocking, or it's just changed and transformed in a way that it shapes your experience of this place, you've suddenly had the opportunity to think about a new user experience. My favorite example of this comes from 1969, I believe. The American side of Niagara Falls was in danger, or they thought, of being eroded. So the American Corps of Engineers took the opportunity to de-water the place. So Niagara Falls is iconic for being full of water, as it were, and they took this opportunity to de-water Niagara Falls, causing a pause in the waterway. But instead of just leaving it that way, they put a tiny little pathway along the edge of Niagara Falls so that visitors could otherwise, inhospitable territory, this dangerous falls, could actually walk there and create new meaning out of the place that they were in. Look at the falls completely differently. Redefining space is something that's really interesting in architecture, something interesting in the frameworks and the platforms that we design as well. And this example is a Singaporean void deck. You guys all know what a Singaporean void deck is, right? So in Singapore, like 80% of the people live in public housing. And much of the public housing has what's called a void deck underneath, which is this empty space that gets redefined every time a new event comes up. Nothing is permanently there. There are weddings there, there are funerals there, birthday parties, marriage proposals, and so on. But what's interesting about this void deck is it just gets redefined depending on use. Paco Underhill talks about these empty spaces as being incredibly important to commerce. He wrote a book called Why We Buy: The Science of Shopping, among others, in which he talks about the transition space that happens inside a retail environment as being a dead zone or a blind spot. He calls them landing strips. He says when people walk into a commerce environment, it's Barnes & Noble on Fifth Avenue in New York, they don't see. And he said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, like if you watch people long enough when they walk into a store, you'll see that they're not really there yet. But if you watch them long enough, you'll see that actual moment where they transition between inside and outside. And if retail designers understand this blind spot, they can design for it. It's one of the reasons why there's often just flyers and things that you don't need to see sort of inside doorways. And I think it's incredibly important for us to think about when the retail environment becomes something that we can't put our hands around. So this morning we heard from Tim and Keegan that the future is mobile. And again, I'm paraphrasing. But if the future is mobile, what does it mean that we are designing for these retail environments? Where is the transition space? How do we understand where people are pausing and how we can get them from outside to inside? Jan Chipchase, who's a designer, I think the creative director at Frog is now his title, captured something really beautiful about 2 weeks ago. He called it the hand pause. It's this moment where a user's device is catching up with their intent. It's this interesting moment that we rarely see our hand in a paused position. We're rarely thinking about what we might do in that space. We think about it really clearly in the retail environment, but we don't think about it as much when it comes to this moment where retail is happening anywhere and everywhere. So if we know that a pause is happening here, what can we do about this pause? What could we do while our devices are waiting to sort of catch up with our intent? I like an example of this just because it's kind of like, feels a little bit dirty and scandalous, but it also, I think, is something that we never kind of see, which is this man named Kurt Kavitzel from 1997. He lives in Zurich, and he was sitting in his apartment building and launched this project whereby he looked outside at people waiting at a red light and watched them in paused states, inspecting their bodies, with friends, kind of like looking at what they might do when constraints are such that you put together an experience for yourself that you think no one else can see. Because we're rarely seeing other people, particularly our users, or even ourselves, in this paused moment. Think about what happens when we leave the constraints up to our users. This is a very constrained environment, a traffic light. It's an old sort of device. But this project, which is Hans Monderman, takes the constraints away, in that this is from Drachten in the Netherlands, and the traffic signals by Hans actually, Hans Motorman does sort of transportation planning, and he's working on a project called shared space, or under the auspices of this idea of shared space anyway. And in this intersection, he's removed all the traffic signals. What's interesting about this is that it's then up to the individual, the user, if you will, to decide when to pause and when to go. The constraints are then removed, and they have to rely on seeing one another and paying attention to other people in order to know how to respond. It's much like the way that we design today, much like the experiences that we think about today are in this kind of stop and go motion. And you guys can sit here and pause for a long time to wait for an accident, but you won't see one, because in these intersections, accidents have gone down to nearly zero. So thinking about the urban environment and where people kind of sit and stand and walk, I think sound and music specifically is an interesting aspect for us to consider as well. What is all around us at any given time? What do we hear? And what can we plan for? There's a neuroscientist whose name is Joan O'Lehrer, who talks about music being only interesting because of the tension. So if it weren't for the tension, that source of tension, you think about the Jaws score, we wouldn't actually feel any kind of excitement. What's going on is that your brain actually likes it better when you play hard to get with it. And I don't know if this translates to all kinds of things, but we'll talk about music specifically. So when your brain gets excited about this. So when your brain can't figure out what's going on in music, the reward is actually much better when it finally understands, oh, I get it, it was a pause. And now I'm being rewarded with this like great crescendo, right? So your brain loves this idea of sort of complexity that it can discern. And the music is then enhanced by this very thing. So this pause in music was actually given a name. It goes back to classical music, to Chopin, and we can look at Chuck Berry, similar characters, right? But semisonic, I'm going to put them all in the same paragraph. Semisonic, in 1988, came out with their sort of one hit, unfortunately, called Closing Time. I'll just play this. Yeah, remember this. Where'd they go, by the way? What happened to semisonic? But this clip, this little pause, not as dramatic as something like The Strokes, which came later, just a bit later, was given a name by Bob Clearmountain, who produced that record at the time. And the Clear Mountain pause has been an important part of music. The pause is now given a name. It has a vernacular. But I think more important for us as people who design experiences is this guy. Does anybody know this guy? Yeah. So this is John Cage. John Cage, in the 50s, put together a piece in 3 movements called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, or 4:33. So I'm going to just play you a quick clip of that. No, I am. Not in that way. We did that already.
This is the piece.
Okay, so the secret that you all know at this point is that 4:33 is 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. Highly controversial. No one went running out of the theater screaming or anything like that, which has happened before. But his intention was that the audience listen to the natural sounds around us. What do we hear when we sort of are focusing on hearing? When we're focused on a particular intention, what do we hear about the sounds around us? I think this is just interesting for us to consider, and I just kind of really like John Cage and it seemed to fit in. But I think it's interesting for us to consider because the context for which we're designing we can't predict. So to consider the natural sounds that are around us and put our sort of future users in a situation where we can imagine the environmental sounds that affect them, which then impact the experiences we design, I think is something that is incredibly interesting for us to consider. So I want to actually talk more about user experience specifically, and how all of these pauses and this sounds of silence can inform the work that we do every day. It's like we're designing websites, not music, unfortunately. So this past Sunday, the New York Marathon happened. And the New York Marathon is something difficult to sort of get into, not necessarily because of all the costumes, and there are many, but because of how much it takes to train for the marathon. So the training is the hardest part. Has anyone ever done the New York Marathon? Wow. Yeah, it's awesome. So I went to see it on Sunday morning, lots of costumes. There's a place in Brooklyn specifically called Jack Rabbit Sports, which has a great newsletter. Jack Rabbit Sports, once you make a purchase from the store, you're all like reading my email on screen, which is awesome. I'm loving this. So Jack Rabbit Sports, once you make a purchase from them, they will then send you periodic newsletters. So they'll send you this newsletter, and this one specifically, as you can see, it came 7 months after I purchased a pair of shoes from them. And it doesn't just say, whatever, coupon, or it doesn't just mention the store name, but in fact takes 3 data points and uses those 3 data points to create a meaningful experience for me. It tells me about the 400 miles. I don't know if you could read the average life cycle of a pair of running shoes is 400 miles. If you exceed that, you're going to hurt your joints. You are in danger of hurting your joints. And an average person runs 15 miles a week. So it's giving you all this information. By the way, we'll give you a coupon. You can buy it now. In fact, we'll deliver it to your house. Makes it really hard to say no to this. But what's interesting, if you think about these 3 data points, data point 1, I purchased sneakers at Jack Rabbit Sports. 2, they know their product, and they know the date of the product. All right, so they have 3 data points, and they've then created a meaningful experience for me that filled in the gap between my purchase date and a future goal, which might be to continue to run. They've made assumptions that I'm running with the shoes, right? They had to make some leaps of faith, but chances are good if they know their product, they know probably some of the things that I might be doing with it. Well, there's a guy named Josh Porter who wrote a book called Designing for the Social Web, where he talks about this life cycle that a customer might have. It's called the usage life cycle, and it spans this time between a customer being completely unaware and a customer being super happy and passionate about your product. In between these gaps, where someone goes from being unaware to interested, someone goes from being sort of a first-time user to a regular user, he puts in these hurdles. So he actually calls them hurdles, and he actually designs them to be hurdles. These are gaps or big pauses in our experience with the brand, in our experience with the product. How do we think about the fact that pauses have information contained in them and designed for that? Jack Rabbit, as one example, has done an excellent job of filling that gap with meaningful information. They made assumptions about what I was doing, and they used their 3 data points to make a completely meaningful experience for me. So we can fill these gaps, these pauses in the user's life cycle, with meaningful information if we can make assumptions about what people might be doing. Josh goes on in the book to talk about one of his favorite examples of this, which is tripit.com. And tripit.com is a site that you can clearly see what they do, actually. They do a really nice job of displaying what they do in 3 sort of easy steps. Tripit.com fills in the gap for you of how to sort of maintain your travel itinerary. What's interesting about this is that their first iteration of the site created an account for you if you just sent your travel information to this email address. Once you forwarded plans to plans@tripit.com, the site would automatically create an account. No other information needed. But as you can see, they've actually added traditional email and password fields. And what's happened is users were expecting more of a pause, more of a sort of a harder process. So they've gone back to a multi-step process for creating an account because that lack of a pause was not accepted. It was too much information sort of all at once. And I'm sure there were many other reasons. But this Tripit example is an excellent example of someone who not only puts together assumptions about what someone might be doing, but someone that sort of represents this idea of pauses very well. So the pause itself, this idea of silence, this idea of these gaps in our user experience, contain lots of information. So what can we do with that is the question to you. So if a pause is what we used to look at before we came over here at lunch as kind of an empty space, as a negative space, what can we actually do in a moment? What can we do in a single moment that is a pause, whether that pause is like 7 months long or just a single moment that you're kind of flipping through Flipboard? So I want you to take a look at this next couple of minutes of a clip and think about what sort of things are not being said that sort of are being said, and how that experience might be different for each one of you. The designers of this next clip made a lot of assumptions about what you might know and what you might bring to this to fill in the information, and it's sort of an elegant way of saying things without saying them. So that's an experience designed by Everynone, which is a little film studio in New York in partnership with like Radiolab and public radio stations in New York and National Public Radio. So every person that views that typically has a different interpretation of how many experiences are involved. There are, in fact, 9 pieces of discrete information presented in that little clip, but because they're not being said, the comments on a particular post that introduced this had hundreds and hundreds of interpretations of how many experiences were actually designed to be part of that clip. People had different words for them. They used different vocabulary, and without being said, they actually inserted a lot of meaning and didn't need to say anything because it actually allowed for each individual person watching it to bring their own experiences to it. So did anyone else count 9? No? Okay, we can talk about it later. So in these moments where things are not being said, and there are many of them, they go from sort of this moment of silence that we began with to semicolons, one of my favorites, to pause buttons. How can we think about using these as part of our design? How can we think better about the way that we design and the method that we use to design? So I say this only because as a person who doesn't like to sort of speak of being busy, but as a person who tends to do a lot, we need to figure out ways to take a bit of a pause ourselves. And I would say that there are lots of people trying different things. Jonah Lehrer, again, the neuroscientist, talks about taking a walk as actually being a good piece for your design work. Actually getting out of your environment and figuring out a way to stop actually resets your creative process. When you go back to your work, it's actually reinvigorated. In the same way, I'll make this reference that we talked about earlier, whitespace invigorating the elements around it. Your actual walk in the woods, whether it's in the middle of a city or down the street, actually reinvigorates your design process as well. And so if you ever need an excuse to get out of the studio or the office, you can actually use this neuroscience reference to do so. Cameron Mall actually uses his shower, as it happens, and brings a whiteboard into the shower and claims that this is one of the places he comes up with his best ideas. So this sort of walk, this break from your creative process, this pause in what your normal routine is, doesn't necessarily have to be in the middle of a forest or down a path. It can actually be in your very own house, a place that you segment that's a pause away from your creative space. On my own personal site, I try to, this Bobulate.com, I try to take a pause at 6 o'clock p.m. and 6 o'clock a.m. when my site makes a visual change between day and night to demonstrate that maybe it's time to sort of reevaluate how we're working in a time where we used to have these sort of pauses that were naturally built in, where like the newspaper might have been delivered at a certain time or a school bell went off at a certain time, at a time where these kind of moments that were constrained and specifically designed for us are now absent. How can we think about adding those pauses once again? So I would say to you that now, at a time when we're kind of continuing to like rush forward and always think about being connected and always think about the next thing, we might actually be missing particular pieces of information that are very much contained in these moments of silence, in these moments of pausing. And instead of rushing forward all the time, I would ask you just to sort of take a moment and pause. So, thanks very much.